They thought it would be punishment. Louisiana, 1944. The air did not move. It pressed down instead, thick as wet cloth, wrapping around skin, filling lungs with something heavier than breath. The transport truck rolled through the camp gates just after noon, its tires grinding over packed dirt baked hard under a sun that refused to soften. In the back, 30 German women stood shoulder to shoulder, their gray uniforms darkened with sweat, their hands resting at their sides not from discipline, but from lack of strength. When the truck stopped, no one spoke. The engine cut. The silence that followed was not quiet. It carried insects, distant voices, the low hum of something alive in the marsh beyond the fence. One by one, they stepped down onto American soil, boots hitting ground that felt foreign in a way they could not explain. Softer, warmer, unbroken. Anna Weber was the fourth to step off the truck. She did not hesitate, but she did not rush. Her eyes moved before her body did, taking in everything. The watchtower, the guards, the open space beyond the wire. She noticed what wasn't there first. No shouting, no raised rifles, no urgency. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Behind her, one of the younger women whispered something in German, too quiet to carry, but enough to ripple through the line like a shared memory. They had been told what to expect. Cruelty, humiliation, hunger that would stretch days into something unrecognizable. They had prepared for it during the crossing, whispering in the dark of the ship's hold, building certainty out of fear. It had made the unknown manageable, predictable. But this stillness, this order without visible threat, left nothing to brace against. A guard approached, clipboard in hand. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform clean despite the heat. Sergeant William Carter. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Line up," he said, his tone even, as if he were asking rather than commanding. The women moved into formation, instinct guiding them more than instruction. Anna took her place, feet shoulder-width apart, hands steady at her sides. She kept her gaze forward, but she saw him in the edges of her vision. He checked his watch, made a mark on the paper, looked up, not at them, through them, like a man measuring distance, not people. Hours passed without shape, processing, counting. Assignments delivered in clipped English, translated in fragments by someone whose German broke apart under pressure. The sun climbed higher, then held. The air did not cool. Sweat dried and returned again. Time stretched thin. By late afternoon, the routine shifted. It was small at first. A movement near the far end of the compound. A gathering. Men in uniform standing around something large, metal, low to the ground. Steam rose in slow curls, thick and white, carrying with it a smell that did not belong to anything the women recognized. It was sharp, spiced, alive in a way that cut through the stagnant air. The women noticed all at once, though none of them spoke. Heads tilted, just slightly. Eyes shifted, just enough to break formation without breaking discipline. Anna watched the steam rise, watched the guards move around it with an ease that did not match the weight of the day. There was laughter. Not loud, not forced, just present. It didn't fit. Nothing about it fit. Beside her, the same young woman whispered again, this time louder, fear slipping into the edges of her voice. Anna didn't respond. She kept watching, because something was wrong. Not dangerous, not yet, but wrong in a way that unsettled everything she thought she understood. The smell grew stronger, the steam thicker, and for the first time since stepping off the truck, Anna felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not relief, but a question she could not yet answer. The smell reached them before the meaning did, drifting across the yard in slow, steady waves that cut through sweat and dust, and something older, something they had carried with them across an ocean, a memory of scarcity that had settled into their bones. It was not the smell of soup or bread or anything they could name. It was sharper than that, layered, heavy with spice and heat. And it made no sense in a place where they had prepared themselves for ration lines and silence and control. The guards did not rush, did not bark orders. They moved around the metal pot with an ease that suggested routine. One of them lifting a lid just enough to release a burst of steam that rose and disappeared into the humid air, and for a moment the entire yard seemed to pause with it. Anna kept her eyes forward, but her attention shifted completely, narrowing onto that single point across the compound, measuring distance, counting steps, calculating without realizing she was doing it. Beside her, a woman shifted her weight, the smallest movement, but it carried tension, the kind that builds when expectation begins to fracture. "Do not look," someone whispered, but everyone already had. Sergeant Carter closed his clipboard with a soft sound that barely carried, then slid it under his arm, his gaze moving across the line. Not to inspect, not to challenge, but to confirm something only he understood. He gestured once, brief, controlled, and the formation broke. Not chaotically, not with confusion, but with the kind of hesitation that comes when rules change without explanation. "This way," he said, and his voice was the same as before, even, almost indifferent, as if this were no different from anything else that had happened that day. They followed because there was nothing else to do, boots pressing into dirt. That gave slightly underweight, a subtle difference that none of them would have noticed before, but now every detail felt amplified, every sensation sharpened by uncertainty. As they moved closer, the smell intensified, wrapping around them, filling their mouths before anything had touched their lips, and Anna felt her body react before her mind could form a thought, a tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar, something she did not trust. The pot came into full view, metal darkened by use, water rolling at a steady boil, red shells rising and falling beneath the surface like something alive, and for a second, just a second, the image did not register as food. It looked too bright, too vivid against the muted tones of the camp. One of the guards laughed quietly at something another man said, reaching in with a tool, lifting a piece out, letting it drip before setting it aside. No one rushed forward to serve. No one explained. The women stopped several feet away, forming a loose line without being told, their posture caught between discipline and disbelief. Anna studied the men, not the pot, watching their hands, their faces, the absence of urgency, the absence of anything that resembled control through fear. If this were punishment, it was unlike any she understood. If it were something else, she could not yet define it. Carter stepped forward, closer to the pot now, and, for the first time since they had arrived, he did something that drew every eye without effort. He rolled up his sleeve slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had stretched, then reached toward the table beside the pot and picked up one of the red shells. He did not look at them when he did it. He looked at the food, focused, calm, as though the presence of 30 silent prisoners did not exist. Anna felt the shift before anyone moved. A subtle change in the air, like the moment before a storm, breaks or disappears entirely, and she realized with quiet certainty that whatever happened next would not match what they had been told, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. He did not hurry, and that was the first thing Anna noticed. In a place where every movement since capture had been measured, controlled, or forced, his stillness carried a different kind of authority, one that did not demand attention but held it anyway. Sergeant Carter turned the red shell in his hand, studying it for a brief second, as though confirming something simple and ordinary. Then he began to peel it, fingers working with practiced ease, separating shell from meat without hesitation. Without pause, the motion fluid, familiar, almost routine. No one spoke. The only sound was the low boil of water behind him and the faint clicking of shell against metal as he set the pieces aside. Anna watched his hands, not his face, because hands did not lie. They revealed intention in ways words could not. There was no tension in his grip, no calculation in his movement, only repetition, the kind learned over years, not invented for a moment. When he finished, he held the small piece of food between his fingers for a second, then brought it to his mouth and ate. He did not look at them when he did it. He did not wait for a reaction. He chewed slowly, calmly, as if standing in the middle of a quiet kitchen rather than in front of 30 prisoners who had been taught to expect cruelty. The moment stretched. Anna felt it settle over the group like a weight that was not heavy but impossible to ignore. Beside her, someone exhaled softly, the sound almost breaking the surface of silence before disappearing again. Carter swallowed, wiped his fingers on a cloth, then reached for another piece, repeating the process without variation. Peel, separate, eat. Nothing hidden, nothing withheld. The simplicity of it made it harder to understand. If there had been anger, it would have been easier. If there had been force, it would have made sense. But this quiet demonstration, this absence of threat, left no clear response. Anna's mind moved through possibilities with precision, testing each one and discarding it. Poison did not make sense. Deception required an audience that reacted, and he was not watching. Punishment required fear, and there was none in his posture. She shifted her weight slightly, the movement small but deliberate, and stepped forward half a pace. No one stopped her. No one acknowledged it. The guards continued as they had before, lifting pieces from the pot, placing them onto trays, moving with a rhythm that suggested this was not an exception but a habit. Anna looked at the food now, really looked at it, the color sharp against the dullness of everything else, the steam rising in soft curls, carrying that same unfamiliar scent that had reached them earlier. It was not unpleasant. That was what unsettled her most. It did not carry the warning her mind expected. It carried something else, something she could not name but recognized in a distant way, like a memory from a different life. Behind her, the line held, no one advancing, no one retreating. They waited, not because they were told to, but because no one knew what came next. Carter finished the second piece and finally looked up, his gaze moving across them briefly, not searching, not challenging, just acknowledging their presence in the simplest possible way. Then he stepped back, leaving space between himself and the table, as if the next move no longer belonged to him. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but Anna felt its weight immediately. It was not an order. It was not permission. It was something else entirely, an opening. She stood there. For a second longer, the heat pressing against her skin, the smell filling her lungs, the silence stretching thin, and then she understood what had changed. For the first time since capture, the choice was hers. Anna did not move immediately, and that pause mattered. It stretched just long enough to make the air feel heavier, to make every eye behind her settle into stillness, waiting for something that had no clear shape. She stepped forward slowly, not with hesitation, but with control, each step measured against the ground beneath her boots, closing the distance between herself and the table where the red shells rested in quiet abundance. No one stopped her. No one spoke. Even the guards seemed to fade into the edges of the moment, their presence reduced to background, like the hum of insects that had never left. She reached the table and stopped, standing close enough now to see details she could not from before, the texture of the shell, the way steam clung to its surface before disappearing, the small pool of seasoned water collecting beneath it. It did not look like anything from home. It did not resemble the food she had known before the war, before everything had narrowed into survival and absence. She looked at Carter once, briefly, not for permission, but for confirmation. He did not nod. He did not gesture. He simply stood, his attention already elsewhere, as if the decision no longer concerned him. Anna understood then that whatever this was, it was not a test designed for failure. It was something simpler, and because of that, harder to accept. She reached out and picked up one of the pieces, her fingers brushing against the shell, feeling its warmth, its solidity, something real in a place where so much had become abstract. The heat surprised her, not painful, just present, grounding. For a second, she held it there, suspended between action and restraint, her mind searching for a reason to stop, for a warning she could recognize, but none came. Behind her, the others watched without moving, their silence not empty, but filled with the weight of shared uncertainty. Anna adjusted her grip, imitating what she had seen, peeling back the shell with careful precision, her movements slower, less practiced, but deliberate. It came apart easier than she expected, revealing something pale beneath the surface, something that looked almost fragile compared to the hard exterior. She paused again, the piece in her hand, her breath steady, her body still. This was the moment, she realized, the point where everything she had been told met everything she could see. If she stepped back now, nothing would change. If she moved forward, something would. She brought it to her mouth and took a bite. The taste arrived immediately, not gradual, not subtle. It filled her senses in a way she was not prepared for. Rich, spiced, layered with something that felt both unfamiliar and deeply grounding at the same time. Her body reacted before her thoughts could form, a brief stillness, then a shift, Something loosening in her chest that she had not noticed was tight. She did not close her eyes. She did not step back. She simply stood there, holding the remaining piece, processing something that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with recognition. Behind her, someone moved, a single step forward, then another. The line began to change, not quickly, not all at once, but with a quiet momentum that spread without instruction. One woman reached the table, then another, each repeating the same uncertain process, each encountering the same unexpected result. The yard remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was something else, something fragile, forming in the space between expectation and reality. Anna swallowed slowly, her gaze lifting just enough to find Carter again. He was not watching her. He was looking out beyond the fence, as if the moment unfolding behind him did not require his attention. And for the first time since she had stepped onto American soil, Anna understood that the absence of control could feel more powerful than its presence. The first sound did not come from speech. It came from breath, a quiet, uneven inhale that caught somewhere between surprise and memory, and then another, and then the faintest tremor of movement, as one of the women behind Anna lowered herself onto a nearby crate without realizing she had done it. The food in her hands forgotten for a second, as something else surfaced, something deeper than taste. Anna remained standing, the second bite still in her fingers, but she did not bring it to her mouth right away. She watched instead, not the guards, not Carter, but the women, the way their posture began to shift, shoulders that had been locked in place since arrival now loosening by degrees too small to measure but impossible to miss. One woman laughed, but it was not laughter in the way it had been before the war. It was short, almost startled, as if the sound itself had surprised her. Another covered her mouth, chewing slowly, eyes unfocused, not looking at the yard or the table or anything present, but somewhere else entirely. Anna understood that look. She had seen it in hospital wards, in moments when pain gave way not to relief, but to realization, the kind that arrived quietly and changed everything without asking permission. She lifted the piece again and finished it, more deliberately this time, allowing the flavor to settle, to stay, to exist without being questioned. It was not just food. It was consistency, warmth, abundance in a place where none of those things were supposed to exist. Around her, the line dissolved completely, no longer a formation but a gathering, each woman moving at her own pace, choosing her own moment, no longer bound by the invisible structure that had defined them since capture. One of the younger prisoners reached for another piece too quickly, then slowed herself down, as if remembering something about dignity that had been buried under weeks of survival. She peeled it carefully, copying what she had seen, her hands steadier now, her breathing more even. Anna noticed these details without effort, her mind recording them the way it always had. But something was different. She was no longer analyzing for threat. She was observing for understanding. A tear fell, not loudly, not dramatically, just a single drop that landed on the dry dirt and disappeared almost instantly. Then another. The woman who had laughed earlier sat down fully now, her shoulders shaking, not from fear, but from something that had no clear boundary. Anna turned her head slightly, just enough to see her without staring, and in that small movement, she felt it too, not as an emotion that overwhelmed her, but as a quiet shift, a release of something she had been holding without knowing it. Carter still had not intervened. He had not explained. He had not acknowledged what was happening. He stood at the edge of the scene, hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture unchanged, as if the absence of control was the point itself. Anna realized then that this moment did not belong to him. It did not belong to the camp. It did not belong to the war. It belonged to the space between what they had been told and what they were now experiencing. She reached for another piece, not because she was hungry, but because the act itself carried meaning, a continuation of something she was only beginning to understand. Around her, the sounds changed, quiet at first, then more present, the soft rhythm of peeling shells, the occasional breath that caught before settling again, the faint, almost disbelieving murmurs that passed between them in low German, words not fully formed but understood anyway. No one gave orders. No one corrected them. The structure had dissolved into something simpler, something human, Anna looked up once more, her eyes finding Carter. Again, and this time, when she saw him looking out beyond the fence, she understood why. He was not ignoring them. He was giving them the space to become something other than what the war had made them. And in that realization, something inside her shifted completely, not loudly, not all at once, but with a quiet certainty that would not reverse. The rhythm settled slowly, not imposed, not directed, but formed in the space between hands and breath, between memory and the present moment. Shells cracked open, pieces set aside, fingers moved with increasing confidence, the unfamiliar becoming familiar not through instruction, but through repetition. Anna noticed how quickly the body adapted when fear was no longer in control, how hands that had trembled only minutes before now worked with steady precision, how shoulders that had been drawn tight began to lower without conscious thought. One of the women wiped her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint line across her cheek where tears had been, but she did not stop eating. She continued, slower now, more deliberate, as if each bite required acknowledgement. Anna felt something similar in herself, not hunger, not even relief, but a quiet awareness of presence, of being fully in a moment that did not demand survival, only participation. The heat had not changed, the air was still heavy, the insects still constant, but it no longer pressed in the same way. It had become background instead of burden. She picked up another piece, turning it in her hand before peeling it, noticing the texture, the resistance of the shell, the way it gave under pressure. Details that would have been invisible before now held weight. Around her, voices began to emerge, low at first. Fragments of German spoken not in fear, but in recognition, small exchanges that carried disbelief. Without needing explanation, "It is real," someone said quietly, not asking, just stating. Another nodded, though no one had asked her either. Anna listened without turning, absorbing the shift not as something external, but as something collective, shared without coordination. Across the yard, a guard leaned against a wooden post, watching without intrusion, his posture relaxed, his presence steady but unobtrusive. No one hurried them. No one limited the time. The absence of urgency stretched the moment further, allowing it to settle into something lasting. Anna realized that this was not generosity performed for effect. It was routine offered without expectation, something given without needing acknowledgement. She glanced once more toward Carter. He had moved slightly, not closer, not farther, just enough to remain at the edge of the scene, his hands now resting loosely at his hips, his gaze still directed outward, as if guarding something larger than the perimeter of the camp. She understood then that his distance was intentional, that stepping back was part of the act itself. It left space for them to respond without being observed, without feeling measured. One of the older women straightened slowly, her movements careful but no longer rigid, and for a brief second, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in something closer to acceptance. When she opened them again, her expression had changed, not softened, not weakened, but steadied. Anna recognized that look as well. She had seen it in patients who had crossed from uncertainty into clarity, not because their situation had improved, but because their understanding had shifted. The war had not ended. Their status had not changed. The fence still stood, but something within the boundary had moved. Anna finished another piece and set the shell down beside the others, her hands no longer uncertain, her movements aligned with the rhythm that had formed around her. She did not rush to take another. She allowed the pause, the space between actions, to exist, and in that space, she felt it. Fully for the first time, not as a reaction, not as an emotion that rose and fell, but as a quiet, steady presence. Trust, not complete, not unconditional, but undeniable in its beginning. It did not arrive with words. It did not require agreement. It existed in the simple fact that she was still standing there, still choosing to remain, still willing to take another step forward without being told. And that, more than anything else that day, changed the shape of everything that would follow. The moment did not end, but it changed shape, stretching into something quieter, something that settled into the edges of the day rather than standing at its center. The sun had begun its slow descent, not enough to cool the air, but enough to shift the light, casting longer shadows across the yard, softening the harsh lines that had defined everything only an hour before. Anna noticed it without looking directly. The way the brightness eased just enough to make the space feel less exposed. Less like a place where every movement had to be measured. Around her, the women had stopped rushing entirely, their pace now unforced, each action carried out with a kind of attention that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with presence. Some sat on crates. Others remained standing, but the rigid uniformity that had held them together since arrival had dissolved into something more natural, more human. A woman near the end of the table began to speak, her voice low, almost careful, as if testing whether words were still allowed in this space. Another responded, not in whispers, but in a tone just above it, enough to be heard without drawing attention. The conversation did not grow, it unfolded slowly, each sentence placed with intention, as if language itself needed to be relearned in this new context. Anna listened without turning. Her focus still divided between what was in front of her and what was happening around her, the two no longer in conflict. She reached for another piece, but paused before picking it up, her hand hovering just above the table. She realized then that she was no longer reacting to the moment. She was choosing how to move within it. That distinction was small, but it carried weight. She picked it up, peeled it with practiced ease now, and ate, not out of necessity, but because the act itself had become part of something larger. Across the yard, one of the guards set down a bucket of water and stepped back without saying a word, leaving it within reach but not offering it directly. The gesture mirrored everything else that had happened, simple, unforced, given without expectation. One of the women noticed, walked over, drank, then carried it back to the others without being asked. No one instructed her. No one needed to. The pattern had already been established. Anna felt the shift deepen, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual alignment, like something inside her had found its place without needing to be directed. She looked once more toward Carter, and this time, he was watching, but not in the way she had expected. His gaze was not fixed on any one person, not measuring, not assessing. It moved across the group with a quiet steadiness, as if confirming that something had settled, that something had taken hold. When their eyes met for a brief second, there was no exchange, no signal, no acknowledgement beyond the fact that both of them were aware of the same thing. Then he looked away, returning his attention to the edge of the camp, to the line where fence met open land. Anna understood that as well. Whatever had begun here did not require recognition to continue. It did not need to be named. It existed in the absence of what had been expected, in the presence of something that had not been promised. The war remained, unchanged, distant and immediate at the same time. Their status had not shifted. The boundaries still held. But within those boundaries, something had opened, something that could not be easily reversed. Anna set the empty shell down with the others, her hands clean now, her movements unhurried. She did not reach for more. She did not step away. She simply stood there, feeling the quiet settle into her, not as relief, not as comfort, but as a steady, grounded awareness. And in that awareness, she recognized something she had not allowed herself to consider before, not fully, not without resistance, that the world beyond what she had been told still existed, and that it could not be reduced to a single idea, a single fear, or a single truth. She did not say it. She did not need to. She only stood there, no longer waiting for something to happen, no longer bracing for what might come next, but present, fully, in a moment that asked nothing from her except that she remain where she was. The light continued to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the edges of the camp no longer felt as sharp, as if the day itself had decided to ease its grip. The heat remained, but it no longer dominated every thought, no longer pressed into every movement. Anna stepped back from the table without thinking about it, her hands empty now, her posture different, not guarded, not rigid, simply balanced. She became aware of the space around her again, not as something to monitor, but as something to exist within. The women nearby had begun to gather in smaller groups, not by order, not by habit, but by something quieter, a shared recognition that did not require instruction. One sat on the ground, legs folded carefully beneath her. Another leaned against the side of a wooden crate, her head tilted slightly as she listened to someone speaking in low, steady German. The words were not urgent, not fragmented. They carried a different weight now, something closer to reflection than survival. Anna moved a few steps to the side, giving space without being asked, her eyes moving across the yard with a calm she did not remember choosing. Near the edge of the group, a woman who had not eaten much stood holding a single piece, turning it slowly in her fingers as if still deciding, still measuring something unseen. Anna recognized that hesitation, not as fear, but as the final resistance of a belief that had not yet fully let go. She watched as the woman finally peeled it, her movements careful, almost ceremonial, and then tasted it, her expression changing not dramatically, not suddenly, but in a way that could not be undone. Anna did not look away. She allowed herself to witness it. Fully, the quiet crossing from one understanding into another. Across the yard, a faint breeze moved through, brief, barely enough to shift the air, but enough to carry with it the scent of the marsh beyond the fence, mixing with what remained from the boil, creating something layered, something that belonged neither entirely to this place nor entirely to what lay outside it. The combination felt strange, but not unsettling. It felt complete. A guard walked past with a stack of empty trays, his steps unhurried, his presence neither intrusive nor distant. He nodded once to no one in particular, a gesture so small it might have been missed if not for the way it fit perfectly into everything else that had happened. Anna noticed it anyway. She noticed everything now, not because she was searching, but because she was no longer overwhelmed by what she expected to find. Her attention had space to expand, to take in detail without attaching fear to it. She turned slightly, her gaze moving toward the fence, following the same line Carter had been watching earlier. Beyond it, the land stretched out in quiet continuity, trees, water, sky, all untouched by the structure that contained them. It did not look like a place at war. It looked like something else entirely, something steady, something indifferent to the divisions that had defined her world for so long. She stood there for a moment, letting that image settle, not as an escape, but as a reference, a reminder that what she saw now could exist alongside everything she had known before without canceling it. Behind her, the voices continued, soft, steady, real. Someone laughed again, this time without hesitation, the sound fuller, less fragile. Anna did not turn toward it. She did not need to. She could feel the change without seeing it. She brought her attention back to the present, to the ground beneath her feet, to the quiet rhythm that still lingered in her hands even though she was no longer holding anything. And in that stillness, she understood something that did not arrive as a thought, but as a certainty, that the moment had not ended when the food was finished. It had only begun to unfold, moving outward, settling into each of them in ways that would continue long after the sun had disappeared and the routine of the camp returned. She did not resist that understanding. She allowed it to remain, steady, unspoken, shaping the way she stood, the way she breathed, the way she looked at everything around her, as if seeing it for the first time without needing to question what it meant. Evening approached without announcement, the way it often did in places where time was measured more by light than by clocks, and the yard began to settle into a quieter rhythm, not empty, but softened, as if the day itself was stepping back to allow what had happened to remain undisturbed. The last of the steam had faded from the metal pot, leaving only the faint trace of warmth in the air, and the table that had once drawn every eye now stood as something ordinary again, its significance no longer in what it held, but in what it had revealed. Anna found herself standing slightly apart from the others, not isolated, not withdrawn, just positioned in a way that allowed her to see without being seen too closely. She watched as one of the women carefully gathered the discarded shells into a small pile, her movements methodical, respectful in a way that had nothing to do with instruction. Another woman took a cloth and wiped her hands slowly, not rushing to be finished, as if prolonging the simple act itself. These were small gestures, but they carried a weight that Anna could not ignore. They were signs of something returning, something that had been suspended and was now finding its place again. Across the yard, the guards began to move with quiet purpose, not to end the moment, but to transition it, their steps unhurried, their voices low, blending into the background rather than cutting through it. No commands were raised, no urgency imposed. The shift came naturally, as if everyone understood without needing to be told that this part of the day had reached its conclusion. Anna noticed Carter once more, standing near the edge of the yard, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. For a moment, she wondered if he would speak, if he would acknowledge what had happened, but he did not. Instead, he adjusted his watch, glanced briefly toward the sky, then turned and began to walk along the fence line, his steps even, his attention already moving forward. It was not dismissal, it was continuity. The day did not pause for reflection, and neither did he. Anna understood that too. Whatever meaning had been created here did not need to be explained to exist. It would remain because it had been experienced, not because it had been defined. She took a slow breath, deeper than any she had taken since arriving, and let it settle, feeling the air move through her without resistance. Behind her, the women began to gather themselves, some standing, some brushing dust from their uniforms, others exchanging quiet words that no longer carried urgency or fear. The structure of the camp would return, the routines would continue, but something within that structure had shifted, something that would not easily return to what it had been before. Anna turned slightly, her gaze moving once more toward the open land beyond the fence, where the light had begun to dim, the colors deepening into something softer, more muted. It looked the same as it had earlier, unchanged, and yet she saw it differently now, not as something distant, but as something connected to the moment she had just lived through. She lowered her eyes back to the ground in front of her, to the place where she stood, and felt the quiet settle again, steady, unforced. She did not speak. She did not need to. The absence of words held more truth than anything she could have said, and as the last traces of the day began to fade, she realized that nothing outward had changed. The war still existed, the fences still stood, the roles remained defined, but inside her, something had shifted with a clarity that required no confirmation. She was no longer waiting for cruelty to reveal itself. She was no longer measuring every moment against fear. She was simply present, standing in a place that no longer felt entirely foreign, holding a quiet understanding that would stay with her long after this day had ended, long after the memory of taste had faded, because it was not the food that had changed her, it was the absence of what she had expected to find. Night did not fall all at once. It arrived in layers, the sky dimming slowly from pale gold to a deeper shade that softened everything it touched, and with it came a shift that was quieter than the one before, but no less significant. The yard emptied in a way that felt natural, not enforced, the women moving back toward the barracks in small groups, their steps unhurried, their voices low but no longer guarded. Anna walked among them, not leading, not following, simply moving with the same steady pace that had carried her through the day. But something in her posture had changed, something subtle that could not be seen from a distance, but could be felt in the way she no longer scanned every corner, no longer measured every sound against expectation. The barracks door opened with a familiar creak, the interior dim, lit by a single overhead bulb that cast long shadows across the wooden floor. The air inside was cooler, but still heavy, carrying the scent of fabric, of dust, of lives paused and contained. Anna stepped inside and stopped just past the threshold, allowing her eyes to adjust, taking in the space as if it were different, even though nothing had physically changed. The bunks remained in place, the thin blankets folded with the same precision, the small personal items arranged exactly where they had been left, but the room did not feel as confined as it had that morning. It felt quieter, not in sound, but in tension. One of the women sat on her bunk and let out a long breath, the kind that emptied more than just air, and another lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling with an expression that was neither relief nor exhaustion, but something in between. Anna moved to her own bunk and sat down, her hands resting loosely in her lap, still carrying the faint warmth from earlier, a sensation that had not entirely faded. She looked at them for a moment, turning them slightly, as if expecting to find something different, but they were the same. It was what they had done, what they had experienced, that had changed, not the hands themselves. Around her, the quiet conversations continued, no longer whispers, no longer fragments, but complete thoughts spoken without hesitation. as if the boundary that had kept words contained had been loosened without anyone noticing when it happened. Someone mentioned the taste again, trying to describe it, failing, then laughing softly at the attempt. Another responded, not correcting, not explaining, just adding to the memory in her own way. Anna listened without joining, not out of distance, but because she did not need to speak to understand. She lay back slowly, her head resting against the thin pillow, her gaze lifting toward the ceiling where the light cast faint shadows that shifted with the movement of the bulb. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to sleep, but to hold the day in place, to allow it to settle fully without interruption. When she opened them again, the room felt steady, grounded in a way it had not been before. Outside, footsteps passed, measured, consistent, the rhythm of the camp continuing as it always had. Nothing had stopped. Nothing had changed in structure. But within that structure, something had been introduced, something that could not be removed by routine or time. Anna turned her head slightly, looking toward the window where the last traces of light had nearly disappeared, replaced by the deeper tones of night. She did not think about tomorrow. She did not try to predict what would come next. For the first time since capture, she allowed the future to remain undefined. She simply remained where she was, aware, present, holding a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained or confirmed. And as the last sounds of the yard faded into the distance, she realized that the day had not given her something new. It had taken something away, something she had carried without question, without resistance, and, in its absence, what remained was not emptiness, but clarity. Sleep did not come quickly, and when it did, it was lighter than before, as if the mind itself was unwilling to fully let go of what had shifted during the day. Anna lay still, her eyes closed but not fully at rest, aware of the quiet movements around her, the soft turning of bodies on narrow bunks, the occasional exhale that carried more than fatigue. The barracks held a different kind of silence now, not the strained absence of sound that had filled it before, but something steadier, something that allowed space for thought without pressing it down. At some point in the night, she opened her eyes again, not from discomfort, but from a subtle awareness that something within her had not yet settled. The ceiling above her remained unchanged, the same faint lines, the same dim light casting uneven shadows, but she did not see it the same way. She watched it for a moment, then turned her head slightly, her gaze moving across the room. A few women slept, their breathing even, their posture relaxed in a way that had not been present before. Others remained awake, staring quietly into the darkness, not restless, not afraid, simply present in the space between what had been and what might come. Anna recognized that state, not as uncertainty, but as transition. She shifted onto her side, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the bunk, feeling the worn wood beneath her fingers, grounding herself in something physical, something unchanged. Her thoughts did not race. They moved slowly, deliberately, returning not to fear, but to the moment that had altered everything without announcement. The steam rising in the air, the deliberate movement of Carter's hands, the absence of command, the space left open. She replayed it not to analyze, but to understand. How something so small had carried such weight. It was not the act itself, she realized, but the intention behind it, or perhaps the absence of visible intention, that had made it real. It had not demanded a response. It had not required gratitude. It had simply existed, and in that existence, it had allowed something else to emerge. Anna closed her eyes again, this time not to hold the memory, but to release it into something quieter, something that no longer needed to be examined. Outside, the distant sounds of the camp continued, footsteps, a door closing, the low murmur of voices passing in the night, all of it part of a structure that remained unchanged. But within that structure, the boundaries felt less rigid, not physically, but perceptually, as if the lines that defined them had been softened just enough to allow something through. Time moved without interruption, the night deepening, the air cooling slightly, enough to ease the weight of the day. Anna felt her breathing, slow, her body settling into the narrow space of the bunk, no longer held in readiness, no longer bracing for what might come. She did not think about what would happen next, about orders or routines or expectations. She allowed those things to remain where they belonged, outside the moment she was in. What remained was simpler, quieter, a sense of balance that did not depend on certainty. And as she drifted closer to sleep, she understood something that had not been clear before, something that did not arrive as a thought, but as a quiet recognition. That change did not always come through force or resistance. That sometimes it arrived through the absence of both, through a space left open long enough for something else to take shape. She did not hold on to that realization. She let it settle where it would, trusting that it would remain without effort. And in that trust, she finally allowed herself to rest. Not because the world had become safe, but because, for the first time, she no longer needed to assume that it was not. Morning arrived with a softness that did not belong to the place. The first light filtering through the narrow windows in thin, pale lines that stretched across the floor and up the edges of the bunks, touching everything without distinction. Anna woke before the others, not from habit, but from a quiet awareness that had settled into her during the night, something that no longer allowed her to remain fully unaware of the moment she was in. She opened her eyes slowly, not startled, not tense, simply present, and for a brief second, she did not move, allowing the stillness to exist without interruption. The barracks was quiet, but not empty, a few soft breaths marking where others still slept. The faint shift of fabric as someone turned, all of it contained within a space that no longer felt as confined as it had the day before. Anna sat up, her feet touching the floor, the coolness of the wood grounding her immediately, a contrast to the heavy air that would soon return as the day progressed. She rested her hands on her knees, looking down at them again, not searching for change, but acknowledging what they now carried, the memory of warmth, of texture, of something given without condition. She stood after a moment, moving toward the small window, her steps unhurried, her posture steady. Outside, the camp was already beginning to move, guards walking their usual paths, the distant sound of metal against metal as routines resumed, the structure of the day reassembling itself piece by piece. Nothing had been altered in form, the same fences, the same towers, the same measured steps along familiar lines. But as Anna watched, she realized that what had changed was not what she saw, but how she saw it. The guards were no longer only figures of authority. They were part of a larger pattern, one that held both control and something else, something quieter, something that did not contradict the first but existed alongside it. She turned slightly as one of the women behind her stirred, sitting up slowly, her movements still carrying traces of the previous day, not in hesitation, but in a kind of awareness that had not been present before. Their eyes met briefly. No words exchanged, but the recognition was there, shared without effort, understood without explanation. The moment passed, not because it needed to end, but because it did not need to be held. Anna stepped back from the window, returning to her bunk just as the first voice of the morning called out from outside. Not sharp, not harsh, simply marking the beginning of what would follow. The others began to wake. One by one, the room filling gradually with movement, with quiet preparation, with the familiar rhythm of dressing, of arranging, of readying themselves for another day. But the rhythm was different now, not in speed, not in structure, but in tone. It lacked the edge that had defined it before, the constant readiness for something unseen. Anna moved through it with the same precision as always, but without the underlying tension that had once guided every action. She adjusted her uniform, smoothed the fabric, tied it into place with practiced hands, then paused for a brief second, her gaze lifting toward the door. She did not anticipate what would happen next. She did not prepare for it. She simply stood there, ready to step forward when the moment arrived. And when it did, when the door opened and the line began to form once more, she joined it without hesitation, not because she had to, but because she chose to move within it. The structure remained, the boundaries held, the day unfolded as it always would. But within that unfolding, something had been carried over from the day before, something that did not fade with sleep or routine. It remained in the way she stood, in the way she breathed, in the way she looked at the space around her, not as something to endure, but as something to understand. And as she stepped out into the morning light, the air already beginning to thicken with heat, she realized that whatever had begun was not confined to a single moment. It had become part of her, quiet, steady, and impossible to return from. The line moved forward under a sky that had already begun to thicken with heat, the early light fading into something brighter, more demanding. And yet Anna did not feel the same tightening in her chest that had marked every step the day before. The ground beneath her boots felt the same. The air carried the same weight. The voices of the guards rose and fell in the same measured rhythm, but none of it pressed against her in the way it once had. She stood in formation with the others, her posture aligned, her movements precise, but there was no strain beneath it, no silent resistance shaping every breath. Across the yard, Sergeant Carter stood near the same place he had occupied before, his figure unchanged, his presence steady, as if he had always been part of this space in exactly this way. He did not look at her immediately, and she did not expect him to. The moment they had shared the day before did not require continuation in any visible form. It had already completed itself. The routine unfolded with quiet efficiency, assignments given, groups directed, the structure reasserting itself without force. Without interruption, Anna followed as instructed, moving toward the work area with the others, the path familiar now, the distance measured not in steps, but in awareness. As they walked, the sounds of the camp settled into a pattern she could recognize without effort, the distant call of a bird, the faint creak of wood under shifting weight, the steady cadence of boots against dirt. None of it demanded attention. It simply existed. When they reached the edge of the field, the work began. Hands moving through tasks that required focus but not urgency. The rhythm steady, unbroken. Anna worked as she always had, efficiently, without complaint, her attention fixed on what was in front of her. But something remained different. She was no longer working to endure the moment. She was working within it. The distinction was quiet, almost invisible, but it changed everything. At some point, she became aware of Carter moving along the perimeter, his path intersecting briefly with her line of sight. This time, when their eyes met, it lasted a fraction longer, not enough to draw notice, not enough to signal anything beyond acknowledgement. But it was there. He did not nod. He did not speak. He simply continued walking, his presence as steady as it had been the day before. Anna returned her gaze to her hands, to the task, but the moment remained, not as something to analyze, but as something that had already found its place. The hours passed, marked not by discomfort, but by the steady progression of light across the field, the sun rising higher, the air growing heavier, the work continuing without interruption. And yet, beneath it all, something held, something that had not been present before. It was not hope in the way she had once understood it. It was not relief or expectation. It was simpler, quieter, a recognition that the world was not confined to what she had been told, that it could contain both structure and choice, both distance and connection, without collapsing into one or the other. When the midday break came, it did not arrive as a surprise. It settled into place naturally, the work slowing, the movement easing, the moment opening again, though not as sharply as before. Anna stepped back, wiping her hands lightly, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, but her awareness fully present. She looked out across the yard once more. The same space, the same boundaries, the same figures moving within it, and understood with complete clarity that nothing visible had changed, and yet everything had. She did not search for meaning beyond that. She did not try to define what had shifted. She allowed it to remain as it was, quiet, steady, undeniable. And as she stood there, the heat rising, the sounds of the camp settling into their familiar pattern, she realized that she was no longer waiting for the moment to end, no longer measuring it against what might come next. She was simply there, fully, without resistance, holding a presence that did not need to be explained or justified. She had not raised her voice. She had not resisted. She had not demanded anything. And yet, something within her had changed the way the world met her, not loudly, not visibly, but with a quiet certainty that would remain long after this day, long after this place, long after the war itself had become memory. She did not speak. She did not need to. She simply continued, steady, grounded, carrying forward. Something that could not be taken from her because it had never been given by force. It had been revealed in silence, and it would remain there, where no one could undo it.